Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of MMO Weekly. I am your host today, producer Johnluke Shaparo, also contributor to the Metsmerized website, and we are here with executive editor of Metsmerized, Michael Mayer. We've got a couple of interesting topics tonight, but first of all, Mike, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good. This is actually the first time I've been on in a little bit. Christian stepped in for me because I was sick for about a month, and honestly, the Mets haven't had a whole lot to talk about since I started feeling better. But here we are. We got plenty to talk about tonight, I guess.
Well, considering the baseball world has definitely, let's just say, lit up over the last couple of weeks with a few things, and I know we're going to touch on a couple of things, not just about the Mets, but also just baseball in general. But it's nice to have you here, and it's good that you're feeling a bit better. So I guess let's begin in terms of prospects with the Mets. So recently, Baseball Prospectus, if I'm getting that right, I apologize if I'm not. They released their top 101 list, and one of the players that we really wanted to touch on was Christian Scott. So, Mike, just to begin, go into a little more about Christian Scott, the player himself, and what puts him on the spot as one of BP's top 101, and how could he be seen as a valuable asset within the organization? I know his name gets really brought up a lot, especially with guys like Mike Vassell and Tyler Stewart. So what do you, first of all, just give us a little more about Christian Scott. Why do you think he was put on that list, and what do you think he could possibly bring to this team as a pitcher moving forward?
Yeah, so to give a little background first, going into the year, Christian Stewart was really like the back end of the 30 of most people's Mets prospect lists. So he was in like the 25 to 30 range. And I think some might not even have had him on their list because essentially he just hadn't thrown a ton of minor league innings and he was still seen as a potential reliever.
Mhm.
Um, he pitched really great this year at numerous levels. And Baseball Prospectus put him in their top 100 at number 88. And that really, if Mets fans and already kind of started hearing about him, which I'm sure they did because a lot of them are tuned into what's happening in the minor leagues. And Scott
Mhm.
pitched all the way up to Double A this year and pitched very well. But that definitely put him on even more Mets fans' minds when you get into a top 100 list, particularly from a pitcher. Because I mean, position players typically kind of take control of these lists. So for Scott to come in at 88, that sent up some flares. Then Mets fans were like, hey, we really need to learn about this guy because look, he pitched at Double A last year. That's where he finished, and good chance that he's going to start the year in Triple A. I'm sure we're actually going to see him quite a bit in Major League Camp too. He's going to be in Big League Camp, so I'm sure we'll get a chance to see him there. I think the thing for him is before even this year, even when he was healthy, he was really mostly a fastball slider pitcher, which is part of the reason why a lot of folks thought he was going to end up as a reliever. This year, not only did his fastball get better, he's got better shape on his fastball than he did previously, thanks to the Mets' new pitching lab that we're starting to hear more and more about.
Mhm.
But he also really improved his changeup. That was a distant third pitch for him before, and for me, it's a major league pitch now, playing off his fastball. And the starts that I watched, it was incredibly impressive to see how he used his changeup and to see the confidence he had in it, considering it was a pitch that he really just didn't get a lot of swing and misses before this year. Um,
Mhm.
it's got a lot more depth to it now, and it, like I said, it pairs well with his fastball. And he already had a good slider. That was kind of his calling card when the Mets drafted him. So now you've got a guy who's got three good pitches, three major league pitches, and when you do that, that's why you make it on these lists, and that's why you start getting talked about as a potentially big league starter. I don't think it's potentially. I think it's a matter of what type of major league starter he ends up at this point.
Right.
Not only did he develop that third pitch, but he had command of all three of his pitches this year, which, again, if you're able to do that, makes you a big league pitcher.
Mhm.
Um, and I
Right.
think the upside's there too, where if he can continue to command all three of those pitches at the big league level, We're not just talking about a back end starter. This is a guy that has 2-3 potential, number 2 or 3 starter potential, and that's certainly music to Mets fans' ears, right? Because
Oh yes.
we had when DeGrom, Matz, Syndergaard, Wheeler, when these guys arrived, like that was kind of the last time the Mets really had any terms of success, and that was also the last time the Mets really developed any starting pitching too. It's kind of been a lot of misses when it comes to starting pitching through the Mets farm system. David Peterson's shown some signs. Tyler McGill has shown some signs, but outside of that, the last, 6 to 7 years, once those guys that we previously mentioned came up, there hasn't been any productive major league starters that they've been able to develop. So if Scott continues on this track, like I said, I think he's going to pitch in the big leagues this year. Because the Mets did add some depth in starting pitching, but let's face it, every year that just about every major league team goes to 9, 10, 11 starters. That's just the reality of baseball today. So Scott's likely going to pitch in the big leagues this year, and long term, I think he's going to be in the Mets rotation, which is a huge relief for them because while they did add Severino and Hauser and Manaea, all 3 of those guys can be free agents at the end of this year. And Jose Quintana is going to be a free agent at the end of this year. So they certainly need to not only worry about innings this year, but in 2025, they are going to need a bunch of innings from the rotation. And I think Scott's a good chance to do that. And he's clearly at this point the Mets' best starting pitching prospect.
Right. And you actually answered a question I was just about to ask. I was going to say, what do you think a projection of him making the big league roster would be? And obviously you said the major leagues this year. So the way that I see it, I guess, and maybe you can agree with me on that or whatnot. You mentioned the starters, whether it's Manaea, whether it's Severino, whether it's Quintana. So I think with the way that David Stearns is approaching the team, and we'll get to the way Stearns has approached the bullpen in a little bit on this episode. But when you mention how he's approaching the starters, you're having guys like Christian Scott, who you mentioned, and Tyler Stewart and Mike Vassell. I think what he's trying to do is the next year's free agent class is going to have a lot of bigger fish, which they'll end up spending more money on that. So you get a couple of high-end guys to fill in with Senga, and then you can have a guy like a Christian Scott or a Mike Vassell to help take those bottom tier spots to allocate money elsewhere. So that's the way that I see it. And I've certainly looked at Christian Scott in terms of just like his overall stuff and seen some video here and there of him. And I do really like what you see. A lot of what you say is definitely true. He's definitely gotten better with his breaking pitches. I think his fastball and his changeup are really going to, make a difference for him, and the pitching lab is definitely going to really help him a lot. I cannot believe that they were able to turn around Peterson and McGill last year, so it's really exciting to see what they're going to do with guys who have a lot more upside and potential. For some people that don't really know, were there any other Mets named on that BP 101 list? I'm assuming so, because the Mets have a plethora of prospects, but I guess we could probably mention that real quick before we move on to our next topic. But I'm just curious to see what other Mets prospects, for those who haven't seen it, are on that list.
Yeah, so there's been 3 lists that came out so far, and BP was the first one. And also, I would say Mets fans' favorite one, because there's 5 Mets on it, which is the most for any of the list. And Jet Williams was 23. Drew Gilbert was 29. I believe. Where's the next one? Acuna is 76. Clifford was right behind him at 77. And then you had Scott to round it out at 88. So, okay. That's certainly impressive to have 5 guys on the list. That's certainly putting you at in a farm system that's looking at the top 10 overall, and to have Williams and Gilbert right up there in the top 30. Williams just had a huge breakout year, and obviously Gilbert came over in the Verlander deal, and Clifford too. So you got 2 guys in the top 77 prospects according to Baseball Prospectus for Justin Verlander. And obviously last season didn't end the way Mets fans had hoped. But
Mhm.
I mean, you got those two for Verlander, and then you get Acuna, who is a top 100 guy too, for Scherzer. So, and then you got Jeremy Rodriguez, who they got for Tommy Pham, and Marco Vargas, who they got for David Robertson. Both of those guys were mentioned by Baseball Prospectus too in different articles about the 101. Vargas as one of the next 10 guys. So he's a top 111 prospect, I guess you would say. And Rodriguez as a guy who could potentially be in their list next year.
Right.
Rodriguez has gotten a bunch of hype after finishing great with the Mets in the Dominican Summer League. And I
Right.
do think I would mention, because we just talked about starting pitching a lot, want to make sure we mention Blade Tidwell and Dominic
Mhm.
Hamill too, who
Yes.
both pitched in Double-A last year. So,
Mhm.
like I said, the Mets are starting to get some of that starting rotation help. All the five guys that we've mentioned now finished in at least Double-A last year, with Vassell finishing Triple-A. So there's a good chance that, I mean, all of those guys are going to pitch in Triple-A at some point this year and be right there waiting for, like you said, to help potentially this year, but more so definitely to be a help next year.
Hmm. Right. And, obviously over the last couple of months, we've seen the emphasis of wanting to build out the farm system. I know for a lot of fans, myself included at the start, you kind of get annoyed with it because, you see players you see players getting traded away and you kind of don't want to see your team fall apart, especially if you're a season ticket holder. But, you see the vision that they're trying to put onto the franchise. And it's nice to see that they're actually putting their money where their mouth is. So that's really nice. So when we talk about prospects, we can also talk about IFA signings. So the Mets had a bunch of international free agent signings lately. Tell us more about some of those guys and some of the people that they've brought on, and maybe some of the skill sets they bring to the team, because they're just as important as any other prospect, signed or brought onto the team. Francisco Alvarez was one of them. So just, what were some of the Mets international free agent signings lately? Because I know they signed a couple, and maybe highlight some of the ones that are, possible breakout stars. I saw a couple of tweets and tidbits about some of them, that some of these guys actually have a lot of high end talent. So,
Yeah, so I mean, speaking of Francisco Alvarez, natural to talk about Giovanni Rodriguez, who broke Alvarez's IFA bonus from the Mets. He got 2.85 million, which is now the most in Mets history for an IFA player. Um, yeah, I mean, I've talked to multiple Mets people about him, and they're just impressed with how mature his game is, how his skill set is where it is already defensively, whether it's receiving, framing, and he's got a potentially plus arm behind the plate. And that's without getting to his offensive skill set, which is obviously something that is going to be impressive when you're paying 2.85 million for a player.
mhm.
Yeah, they rave about this kid. I think there's a really good chance that he's going to skip playing in the Dominican Summer League, much like Alvarez did. Um, and and I think one thing I want to note before we get into like more of the prospects is, and it stems from Rodriguez. His defensive improvements have really been since the Mets had this deal in place, and I think it's important to note that these deals, January 15th is when they could officially sign. But
Mhm.
a lot of these deals, not all of them, but a lot of these deals are in place for at least a year, some 2 years. Some of these are 3 years in the making.
Mhm.
The Mets director of international scouting did a podcast recently of Steve Barningham, and he said a lot of this was 3 years in the making. And
Mhm.
then Tommy Tanis, who was the vice president, was talking the other day, and he said some of these are even up to 4 years in the making. So
Wow.
it's kind of important to remember just what goes into this from like a scouting standpoint, and then the agreements that they come with, and then also knowing that, so that you know that David Stearns really didn't have anything to do with this particular group of talent,
Mhm.
And the Mets, he's not going to even next year, really. And even after that, there's still players that would have already had agreements before Stearns was even in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is to keep in mind, and again with Rodriguez and some of the other guys I'll mention, is when these guys make these agreements, like I said, it's a couple of years ago, obviously in that time span, players improve. And that's one of the things the Mets saw, and why they're particularly excited about Rodriguez, is the improvement that they've seen over the last couple of years. I mean, 14 to 16 is a pretty important age for prospects because, I mean, just as people, your body has a potential to change quite a bit in that time frame.
Right.
So Rodriguez has certainly upped his talent in the last 2 years. And then the second highest bonus they gave out was $950,000 to Edward Latiga, who is an outfielder. I think that this offensive and defensive skill set from this guy that the Mets are particularly excited about. A guy that has shown some good raw power to all fields and good speed too, potential to stay in center defensively. The third highest bonus they gave out was $500K with two shortstops, Yenzi Rivas and Leander Mella. Rivas is more of kind of like the polished player of the two, switch hitter that's shown good plate discipline already in the games that they have over in the Dominican, and also a good chance to stay at shortstop. Now Mella is kind of a different animal where his skill set is raw power, and that gets you pretty excited when you see it from a young kid like that at 14, 15, 16, because for a lot of players, that's something that develops later. We've seen it with guys that come up to the big leagues that don't have a ton of power, and it kind of develops when they get there. But he already has a lot of that raw power, so that'll be something to watch with him. And speaking of raw power, that brings us to Vladdy Miguel Guerrero, which
yes,
it's funny because I feel like Guerrero might be even talked about more than Rodriguez, and Rodriguez is in the top 5 talent-wise of this whole class. He could be one. You could argue he's top 3. Yet Guerrero is the one that's getting most of the publicity because, hey, he's Vladdy Guerrero's son. He's Vladdy's half brother. And when you watch video of him, albeit from the left side, which is kind of weird when you think Guerrero and then you see him swinging from the left side, it kind of messes with your brain a little bit.
Yeah.
But the transition there was power, and that's what he has. He was in a showcase in the U.S. a couple of years back, and just not the type of power you see from a 14, 15, 16-year-old. It's just, it's very rare to see that. A lot of the rest of his game is kind of raw. He's an outfielder now, but they think he'll probably end up at first base, given his body type. But 117K is obviously on the lower end of some of the higher end prospects that you sign during international free agency. So I'm sure he'll start in the Dominican Summer League. But that's a guy that Mets fans are going to be attached to because of the name. And again, folks like dingers, right? So that's
the long ball.
Exactly. So that's what he brings. So that between that and the name, that's definitely someone folks are going to want to follow.
Right. And just from, some of the research that I've done, and obviously what, you have said, and a lot of what, that has come from the website, it seems as if the Mets are really trying to prioritize both strong defense and offense from a lot of these signings. You can tell there's been a switch in terms of philosophy over the last couple of years, trying to emphasize a lot more defense, but also really, at least from what I see, I could be wrong, but trying to get players who aren't at sort of a peak and that they can kind of, go further up. Like Brett Beatty comes to mind in a sense where, there's a lot that he could improve on, but the raw skill is there. And I see that with a lot of the IFA signings too. So speaking of roster construction, so obviously it seems like with the team as a whole, David Stearns has, from a lot of fans' perspective, probably done an underwhelming job relative to what has happened in the past. And it seems like the main focus for what he's trying to do is the bullpen. So obviously there have been a couple of under the radar names, and like you affectionately put it to me before we started filming this, was that they never played for the Mets. So you had guys like Aroldis Chapman, who signed with Pittsburgh. David Robertson just recently signed with the Texas Rangers. So we kind of see the Mets maybe going away from that really high end, high money guy. So um, give me a little insight on what you see Stearns trying to do with some of the guys that he's brought in, and what do you think they're trying to do with these set arms? Because at least me personally, I know that I think that with the pitching lab that you mentioned, they're getting a lot of high end arms. Well, even though they had high ERAs elsewhere, they're looking to try and mold them into something. And this, I guess, this is something similar to what Stearns did in Milwaukee. So just give me a little more insight on what you think he's trying to do. Maybe some of the guys that signed on other teams, and compare it to how the Mets are building the bullpen right now.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously Stearns has gone with the quantity approach. He knew going into this offseason that they needed a bunch of guys in the bullpen. Outside of Drew Smith, I think the only guy they had on the roster he was the only guy on the roster that threw more than 30 innings last year, because obviously Diaz was injured. So Drew Smith was the only guy that he had on his roster when he became the president. So he knew there was a lot of work to get to Diaz. Like I said, he's done quantity. Guys like Austin Adams, not Pablo Lopez, Jorge Lopez, Johan Ramirez in a little trade, Michael Tonkin, who threw a bunch of outings for the Braves last year. I mean, there's a bunch of other guys that Max Kranick is another guy that they claimed off waivers.
Kyle Crick is another one too.
Yep, Kyle Crick, Andre Scrub. I mean, there's been a bunch of these depth pieces, right? Some of them that did get 40-man spots, some that didn't. And obviously, like you said, this is what Stearns excelled at in Milwaukee, was getting a bunch of arms and making some of them really good in the big leagues. Obviously, that part of that has to come through coaching, and like we're talking about with the pitching lab staff, Jeremy Hefner and his staff. But I do think they are still missing at least a piece or two. And Stern said that a couple of weeks ago when he was doing a press conference. He said that the bullpen was the focus and for the rest of the offseason. And since then, like you mentioned, Chapman has signed, Robertson signed, Josh Hader signed during that time period, and Robert Stevenson signed during that time period too. You can argue those were the four best bullpen arms left on the market. So now there's like Hector Neris, which they've been linked to, Wandy Peralta, which they've been linked to, Ryan Stanek, who they've been linked to, and there's other guys like Adam Ottavino still out there. If he decides he wants to pitch again this year, I think the Mets would have at least some interest on a very low AAV deal there. So it'll be interesting to see how he continues to fill out the bullpen. I don't think they're done there. I mean, he said that they want to keep looking, and there's still, despite that run on relievers, like you mentioned, those are guys that all of them got 10 million, at least 10 million a year. So it's been pretty clear to from Stern's actions that they don't want to spend that money on the bullpen, which I mean, you can certainly understand to a point. I mean, last year they gave Edwin Diaz 102 million. So that's a lot of money in the bullpen already, but you have to get to them, right? You have to be able to get enough guys to get from the starters to Diaz. The biggest contract guaranteed money, I believe, was Lopez, who got 1 year's $2 million.
Hmm.
guaranteed. So I'm sure if they end up signing like the guys we mentioned, Peralta, Nerys, Stanek, I'm sure those guys will end up getting a little bit more than that. But um, yeah, so I think they're looking at certain pitch traits that they want to target, but he also made sure to mention that they want to get a bunch of different looks too. You don't just, last year they kind of they went out and got a bunch of guys the same way via waivers or cheap deals, but they were all guys that threw 95, 96 into a slider.
Hmm.
Almost every pitcher that they got off
Yes.
last off
Yeah.
season for the bullpen was
Yeah.
that same exact pitcher.
That's right.
And now they're kind of mixing it up. I mean, Tonkin is a guy that doesn't throw as hard, and he's a little bit funky with his delivery, but he's
Hmm.
a guy that has shown the last couple of years that he can go multiple innings, and
Hmm.
that's certainly a key in the bullpen. And Lopez, I mean, you're talking about a guy just 2 years ago was a very good reliever. So
Hmm.
those, when you can try to bet on those guys on a very short term deal for not a lot of money, I think that's a really good idea.
So also, I wanted to mention real quick before we get to our last topic, Adrian Hauser. Um, where do you see him on his role on this team? Is he a starter? Is he a reliever? I'm trying to figure that out because I know that when they had acquired him, he was in the rotation, but a lot of people were saying that he could be kind of like the Trevor Williams type pitcher for this team in case somebody doesn't go long, or he can kind of be the long man out of the pen. He's certainly good at what he does. What kind of role do you see Hauser pitching in for the Mets this season, whether he's a starter or kind of like a bridge reliever, sort of, you know?
Yeah, I think he definitely starts the year in the rotation, and then kind of who we talked about, right? Like if Scott pitches really well and forces his hand and comes up, or Vassell, um, or if they pick up another starter. But I think Hauser is in that position where he started quite a bit the last 2 or 3 years for the Brewers.
Hmm.
So I think I think he'll be in the rotation, but he can certainly move to the bullpen, or he can be the bulk guy, like you said. He certainly can fill that Trevor Williams role, which I think is something that kind of missed last year. And
Hmm.
it's
Yep.
also something that folks kind of take for granted too, right?
Hmm.
That's a super valuable type of pitcher. I know we think about the aces or the number two guys and the big contracts that they get in free agency, but the type of guy that Trevor Williams was, and when you lose a guy like that, that's a lot of valuable innings in important
Hmm.
games and saves a lot of arms in non-important games too, which we saw Trevor Williams do, so that those guys are available for the winnable games. So I think whatever Hauser does this year for the Mets, that it's going to be um, he's going to eat up some valuable innings for them, and I think that's probably the most important thing.
Right. And I think that's a good thing because, you know, you look at the way the team was constructed last season, uh, very top heavy on the back end, you know, with Ottavino, Robertson, and Diaz. And then when you lose a guy like Williams and entrust that role into Tommy Hunter, let's just say it wasn't exactly the best course of action, so to speak. Went to a lot of games that it didn't exactly work out, and nothing against the guy. You could just tell he was toast. So hopefully, a lot of these arms that Stearns brought in can really kind of ignite the fire back into bringing a decent bullpen because you know that was arguably one of the, you know, probably the biggest hole on the team last season, and obviously having a healthy Edwin Diaz also definitely helps. So. One more topic before we end our program here today. The Hall of Fame. They just announced the inductees. I'm very opinionated on this, but Joe Mauer, Adrian Beltre, and the other one's blanking on me right now. I know who it is.
Todd Helton.
Todd Helton. Yes, there we go. All three made it to the Hall of Fame. Gary Sheffield and Billy Wagner were two prime candidates, along with Andrew Jones, who missed. Sheffield is going to be off the ballot now. This was his 10th and final year. Billy Wagner's year of eligibility is up next year, after next year. So um, I'll just say this about the Hall of Fame, and I'm not going to defame anybody here. You know, I'm not going to get mad at anybody who makes a certain vote because that's their right to do so. But I just feel that certain players got snubbed for the wrong reasons, and I don't think that's correct. I feel as if Billy Wagner should have made it in this year. Even Gary Sheffield. You can talk about Carlos Beltran possibly down the line, whether you want to go with the cheating scandal or not. And also another thing too to mention is that David Wright will be on the ballot next year. He reached the threshold to stay on another year. So just on that, Mike, just give us a little bit on your thoughts of the Hall of Fame and just about the overall process and who do you think should have made it this year and who do you think could make it next year?
Yeah, I'm good with all the guys that did make it. And yeah, I'm on board with you. I think the fact that Wagner's kind of had to wait this long it's kind of a bummer. I mean, I know when he first started, when he was first on the ballot for a couple of years, he just kind of hovered around 10%. And then there was finally this push like, look, there's already relievers in the Hall of Fame. Lee Smith's in the Hall of Fame. And Lee Smith, no offense, Lee, if you hear this, is not even close to the same level of pitcher that Billy
Right.
Wagner is. You could pretty easily argue that Billy Wagner is the second most dominant closer that we've seen since closers became what they are behind Mariano Rivera. I mean, if you go look at the stats, the ERA, the Ks per 9 innings, all of that different stuff, again, Wagner is right there after Rivera. And look, relievers are only going to get in with more frequency as we go along with this because relievers are becoming more important each and every year. And Wagner he was one of the best and left-handed, one of the best left-handed closers of all time. The good news is he was only 5 short. So the way this process goes, the way you gain votes, he feels like a shoo-in for next year. Unfortunately for Gary Sheffield, he doesn't have that next year. So, yeah, again, this is a guy that, to me, you just look at the numbers and he's a clear Hall of Famer. I know there's been some whispers of steroid stuff, but there's really, he never tested positive. There was no real talk of it. I mean, there wasn't like the McGuire Sosa type stuff that was connected with it. I thought he was a guy that was going to get in. Luckily, I think once the Veterans Committee looks at his numbers, I think it's going to be a no-brainer. But again, you don't want it to get to that point. Beyond, like you said, Beltran, he's a guy that's going to ultimately get in. Had he not had the Astro stuff attached to him, he would have been in already. But he'll eventually get in. And then, kind of lastly, with Wright, I was very happy to see that he's going to stay on the ballot. Look, I mean, Wright's not going to get in the Hall of Fame, and I think it stinks because he was certainly a Hall of Famer when he was on the field, and that was the track that he was on. I do like the fact that this kind of means that we're going to get a look at players with shorter careers that were Hall of Famers when they played. A guy like Johan Santana fell off the ballot after 1 year. And that's a travesty because there's guys with, I mean, you don't want to compare anyone to Sandy Koufax because there was only one of him and what he did was incredibly impressive. But he was a guy that got in with a really short, great career. I think Johan Santana had a very similar career to Sandy Koufax and was off after 1 ballot. Had he stayed on, maybe that conversation changes a little bit and he would have had a better chance of getting in. So for Wright to at least stay on the ballot and stay in that conversation, I think is a good thing to talk about. Guys who had shorter careers but were great when they were playing. And obviously, I mean, as a player, and I think Wright mentioned it when he was on MLB Network, it's just an honor for them every year that they're on the ballot and to be in conversation with guys like this year with Beltre, Helton, and Mauer.
Right. And, you know, that's a good point that you mentioned about players with shorter careers, because I feel, me personally, I feel that players who, you know, made a strong impact while they were playing should be heavily considered. And obviously, you mentioned Sandy Koufax. Johan Santana was one of the probably the premier dominant starter in his time. Granted, his career wasn't as long as you expected due to the injuries, but I mean, everybody was going goo goo gaga, and I apologize for the expression over him when Minnesota wanted to deal him, and obviously the Mets were able to strike while the iron was hot and get him over here. On the case of again with Wagner, you know, he's going to go in next year, hopefully. And it's even more inspiring to see him get this close with, the story that he had, with breaking his right arm twice and then learning how to throw 100 with his left arm. It's arguably one of the best, comeback stories of, baseball ever. And again, again, I'll mention with David Wright too. I feel like as if with social media now, a lot of the discourse is starting to bring these conversations up again. And a lot of us are nostalgic about David Wright. You and I especially got to see him in his prime. I went to a lot of games at Shea Stadium. He was always the one that really popped out in my mind. So maybe by a stroke of luck, sometime down the line, if he doesn't make it, someone looks at that and says, you know what, he's worth it. Then yeah, because I saw something where he had similar numbers to Scott Rowland, except, Scott Rowland played a lot longer than David Wright. And then this also goes into other players like Don Mattingly, Keith Hernandez, the list goes on and on. So we hope that Billy Wagner gets in next year, and by the stroke of luck, David Wright gets in somehow. Anyways, I think that'll be it for this episode of MMO Weekly. Thank you, Mike, again. Thank you to everyone at Metsmerized Online for their wonderful content. And thank you, the fans and the people that watch and listen. So until next time, Sal will probably be back, and hopefully he's not crying about the Jets like I do. And let's go Mets.